Hey guy, and welcome back to the only YouTube channel exclusively filmed in a Denny's parking lot. With the recent announcement of Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, I thought it would be a perfect time to go back and... Pokemon. A series we all know and love that has a habit of giving us a really cool gimmick, only to tear it away from us not much time later. Now, if I were to ask you, how many gimmicks / variants of Pokemon has the series introduced over time? You might have a couple pop into your head immediately. You know, shiny Pokemon. Everyone knows them, everyone loves them. People with too much self-hatred shiny hunt them for hours and hours on end. Then, if you think a little bit further, you think of things like Mega Evolutions, Dynamax and Gigantamaxing, regional forms, things like that. And if you're someone who's familiar with the TCG, you might think of one of the takes of shiny Pokemon they've done there, or Pokemon EX, maybe even Dark Pokemon. People who are primarily fans of the anime and movies, well, you guys probably thought of the clones that Mewtwo made amongst a couple others. So, what seems like a simple question up front, you quickly realize has a lot more layers and answers to it than you might realize. But like, how many can there really be? Like, there can't be that many, right? Right? Oh god, there are so many. Okay, so to start off, the ground rules. We're gonna go over what I will not be counting as a variant or gimmick or something of similar sorts for this video, / kinda just mentioning them here to get them out of the way because they're boring. Number 1. Pokemon whose only difference is the addition of some sort of clothing. For example, the Zarude that has a pink scarf. There's a lot of Zarude. This one just has a pink scarf. It's not really a variant, you could just tie a pink scarf onto any Zarude and it would now be that Zarude. Another example of this would be most of the event Pokemon in Pokemon Go. Like, yes, a Flower Crown Eevee is objectively adorable, however, you can just make a Flower Crown and put it on an Eevee. It's nothing inherently special. Next one I'm not going to be counting is Pokemon whose only difference is being owned by a specific trainer or organization. This one doesn't apply as much to the games and is more so for the TCG because there are multiple cards that are specifically like a Team Plasma Pokemon or specifically a Gym Leader's Pokemon. And while they do have a distinction, they aren't actually a unique variant or anything like that. That's just Surge's Voltorb. Does Surge use a Voltorb? Should've looked that up. Number 3 on the list, we have speculated / debatable Pokemon. Things that are either implied through story or Pokedex entries that we don't actually see. For example, the original legendary beasts. Or there are a few Pokedex entries that allude to some form of pre- or post-evolution that we never actually see in games. Or things like seeing something that implies a pre-evolution on a Pokemon that we never actually get to use. Sort of like a baby Kangaskhan. Number 4, sexual dimorphism. YouTube, you better not get angry at me for that, I'm using it in the scientific sense. This is when there is just a difference between a male Pokemon and a female Pokemon. Like Torchic having the little Torchic having the little black spot on its butt. Don't look up what that is. Number 5. This one kind of ties back into Rule 2 as well, but Pokemon that are unique to the protagonist of the game. Thinking of the partner Pokemon from Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu. While they're cute and they wear hats, they do also learn some special moves. And last but not least, I won't be covering any Pokemon that I forgot about. That's my excuse for if it's not on the list. I forgot about it, and it doesn't matter, so that sucks. Also, we are going to be covering dozens of entries across this list, so some are gonna get more coverage than others, and it's going to be completely biased. Just bear with me. Okay, let's start off with the mainline game's variants. Shiny Pokemon. These alternate colored versions of our favorite Mons have been universally sought after since their initial introduction. Starting in Generation 2, they have gone on to become a truly iconic part of the franchise. Nearly every single piece of Pokemon media or merchandise has featured a shiny Pokemon at some point or another. Another fan favorite, we have Mega Evolution. Despite this being like objective torture to your Pokemon, it still is really cool and I'm excited to see it return in Legends ZA. Honestly, the only sort of like variant Pokemon that may outperform Mega Evolutions in popularity is Shiny Pokemon. In order to Mega Evolve, you use this really interesting bracelet that you slam a gem inside of that corresponds to one of your Pokemon. That Pokemon can get boosted with the power of the gem to varying effectiveness, cool redesigns, and honestly a fair amount of pain on your Pokemon's part. Their visual design, interesting mechanics, impact on casual and competitive play cemented these as something that will never leave the mindset of the player base. Piggybacking off of Mega Evolutions, we're also going to count Primal Reversions because they essentially function the same, but are just a little different lore-wise. The spiritual successor to Mega Evolutions is next. We have Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing. Now, the cool part about Dynamax was it was accessible by every single Pokemon, so no one really got left out, right? Well, that is unless you take into account Gigantamax, because then like a lot of people got left out. Like, I think more than in Mega Evolutions did people get left out. Dynamaxing is the result of an asteroid falling to Earth, spreading radiation around everywhere, and then if you use a special bracelet to harness this special energy, you can make your Pokemon really, really big for 3 turns, and then they get small again. But they glow red. That's cool. And then, of course, Gigantamaxing got all the cool stuff, giving a select pool of Pokemon exclusive forms and access to something called G-Max moves. Honestly, I thought Dynamaxing was really interesting. Don't really care for it to return. Let's go for something brand new in the series, Terra Pokemon / Terrestrialized Pokemon. Similar to Dynamax, any Pokemon can take advantage of it, but unlike Dynamax, this isn't just a big boy form stat boost. No, instead, it does something really interesting, where it'll change your defensive typing to whatever your Terra form is, and give you stab in that typing. As a result, being able to Terra a Pokemon into any type whenever... you have some pretty awesome options for some switch-ups on your teams. And while I do think this mechanic is awesome, it's also subpar in a lot of ways. Mainly for me, I would say in the design department, I kind of wish there was just more variety than, ooh, you get a different hat, and every Pokemon wears the same hat. It's just so boring. I feel like there is way more potential there to give more personality and more creativity to each of the Pokemon when they terrestrialize. Also, huge missed opportunity not giving more Pokemon exclusive Terra forms. Sort of like how the cutest turtle ever gets one, and then just the masks of this other one gets some unique forms. What the hell, Game Freak? Now we're gonna get to the first one that some people might not have been expecting. Titan Pokemon. Now, these are found in Scarlet and Violet, are a result of Pokemon, either Paradox or Modern Day, eating way too much Herba Mystica. You know, so far, wait, Mega Evolution, Dynamax, Gigantamax, Titan Pokemon. It's a lot of just big Pokemon. Alpha Pokemon were introduced in Pokemon Legends Arceus. These Pokemon are bigger, better, and badder than ever. They got red eyes, good stats, and are harder to catch. Although, this is just another big Pokemon. That's weird. Following them, we have the noble Pokemon, also found in Legends Arceus. Now, the noble Pokemon, as the name somewhat implies, is the descendant of Pokemon royalty. They serve as pseudo-guardians slash kind of demigods in some aspects to the local people of Hisui, and their main difference seems to be a sort of heightened intelligence as well as being a lot larger and stronger. Another big Pokemon, but also they get struck by Jesus Lightning and turn Super Saiyan, so that's awesome. Alright, next up we have Totem Pokemon. In the region of Alola, these Totem Pokemon serve as a rite of passage for many trainers. You can tell the difference between a Totem Pokemon and a regular Pokemon due to the Totem Pokemon having a golden aura, being more powerful, and being larger than normal. Another big Pokemon? Regional forms. Regional forms and variants have been seen in multiple games starting in the Alola region. These are interesting takes on Pokemon, asking the question, what if X evolved in a different environment? This gimmick right here needs to be taken advantage of more. There is so much potential, and with over 1,000 Pokemon in the Pokedex, I think it stands to reason to do some world building with variation on those existing 1,000 for a little bit, than to constantly add in more. Sort of like regional, but not at all, we have Paradox Pokemon. These are the results of an egotistical professor trying to break the space-time continuum to travel either forward or backwards in time. However, all they succeed in doing is bringing in ominous monsters from an alternative past or an alternative future. And yes, I say alternative because their Pokedex entries, and multiple of them, directly contradict canon said otherwise. And that fits the paradox nature of their name. So, Paradox Pokemon, different dimension. I think I covered it in this video. Pretty sure I covered it in this video right here. Moving on to another thing from Sword and Shield, we have Brilliant Pokemon. Now, this is kind of known, but I feel like not as well known as it probably should be by now. But do you remember playing Sword and Shield and seeing those little sparkly guys pop up? Well, those were Brilliant Pokemon. They have a few unique characteristics. It has the chance to know an egg move already, it'll have better stats than the average wild Pokemon, and you even get extra rolls for your shiny odds, so you do have a little bit higher chance of a Brilliant Pokemon being a shiny one. Overall, anytime you see a Brilliant Pokemon in Sword and Shield, it's worth going after. Second to last for the mainline game entries, we have Origin Forms. Similar to Primal Reversions, these are exclusive to some legendary Pokemon, and also don't serve too much of a purpose. They do change the aesthetics of the Pokemon, as well as changing the stats and ability of the Pokemon. I think only the ability of Giratina changes, but the stats of the other ones change. And the last one I'm including, honestly, probably should get disqualified with the rules stated earlier, or be put in a miscellaneous category. But this is my video, I do what I want, and I wanted to talk about it here. We're gonna go for authentic versus counterfeit. Now, this is really specific, because it only applies to Poltegeist and Poltergeist and their evolution lines. The reason why I decided to count it is because it actually affects a gameplay element of them. The item you need to evolve them now has actually changed. As a result, I feel like both that and it getting its own specification in the Pokedex, that it kind of deserves its own spot. Moving on from the mainline games to the Pokemon TCG, let's start out with Shining Pokemon. Not Shiny, Shining. This was one of the TCG's variants on Shiny Pokemon. The main difference between these and a regular Pokemon card, besides the aesthetic nature of them, was the fact that I believe you can only have one in your deck at the start, but that rule may have been changed later. Next, we have another take on Shinies, Gold Star Pokemon. Just like the one before, they were restricted to 1 per deck. Radiant Pokemon. Oh, what's that? Another form of shinies, I hear? I know you're excited. I don't know why they kept making essentially the same mechanic, only changing the name of them, but this is not the last time the TCG will do something like this. However, I do believe that at least this version tends to be stronger either in the stat or moves department. I'm not 100% sure because I don't play the Pokemon TCG, but I don't know. Crystal Pokemon. These ones have no 1 per deck restriction, which is a very welcome change in my opinion. They also share the distinct trait of all being colorless monsters, or whatever you call it in Pokemon. Next, we have a double entry in Dark and Light Pokemon. Dark Pokemon were treated in a cruel manner and evolved earlier and more unnaturally than they were supposed to, resulting in a strong but emotionally damaged Pokemon. Light ones, on the other hand, are different. While the Dark Pokemon tended to have this edgy vibe to them, Light Pokemon were depicted in elegant scenes and serene poses. Instead of being more powerful like the Dark ones, they instead had more HP. Although it is interesting that this is one of multiple mechanics that revolves around a Pokemon suffering. This next one I thought was weird when I first heard of it. We have Break Pokemon. These are gold versions of the Pokemon we know and love, and when I say gold, I mean like you spray painted their bodies gold. And I mean like, it feels unexpected, and also it feels like Frieza's probably gonna sue them for copyright infringement. Also, little tangent, as a primarily Yu-Gi-Oh player myself, and Break Pokemon only being played horizontally, I can't help but think Break Pokemon are always in defense mode. Now, when I say Pokemon EX, what comes to mind? How many Pokemon EX do you think there are? In fact, let me give you a little quiz. It's the first 3. These first 3 are all correct. That last one was a red herring. You're a fool if you picked it. I'm gonna go through these quickly because I don't feel like talking about 3 identical mechanics slightly named differently. First up, lowercase EX with no dash. Extremely recent with their introduction, they served as beefed up counterparts to their originals, also being able to terrestrialize as well. Lowercase EX with a dash. These Pokemon EX were superior to their non-extra counterparts in nearly every way. Last but not least, we have uppercase EX with a dash. Alright, Pokemon EX, one last time, let's go.
Now let's go!
These are again superior versions to their non-EX counterparts. There are also Mega and Primal variants of this type, similar to the lowercase EX with Terras. Now, it's ridiculous enough naming not 1, not 2, but 3 mechanics EX. Let's now talk about Pokemon GX.
Game on, yes, game on. Come on, you better play your cards right. Come on and get your game on.
GX Pokemon almost seem to be a take on Z moves for the TCG. I think to compensate for their increased power, they were also restricted to 1 per deck like most of the shinies we talked about. Okay, the next one we're gonna take in a group similar to the EXs. We have V Pokemon, V Star Pokemon, V Max Pokemon, and V Union Pokemon. So let's do what we did with EXs and get through this quick. V. Not to be confused with the protagonist of Cyberpunk 2077, V cards are typically a little beefier and serve as the foundation for the rest of the cards on this list. V Max. These are the TCG's equivalent to Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing. Similar to the games, they have insanely high HP. V-Star, a different kind of evolution for V Pokemon. This is essentially the combination of V and GX cards. Each V-Star has a unique thing called a V-Star Power that can only be used one time per game. And finally, the black sheep of the family, you'll see why I say that in a moment, V-Union Pokemon. A set of 4 cards that can be used to form one large, powerful Pokemon. Each of their pieces, when assembled, gain access to their Union ability, sort of like a very underwhelming Exodia. Continuing the comparisons between the games and the TCG, we have the TCG's take on Brilliant Pokemon, known as Prime Pokemon. Similar to Brilliant Pokemon, they were essentially visually identical except with some sparkles, and boasted better stats. Level X Pokemon. What the mechanic of Level X revolves around is being able to use the moves and abilities of a Pokemon's previous evolution while it's evolved. Honestly, this is pretty interesting. We got a personal favorite of mine coming up, Delta Pokemon. Now, these are like the conceptual origin for Terra Pokemon in a lot of ways, being Pokemon with different types than they would otherwise have while still maintaining the same appearance. It was cool to see this early on exploration of giving Pokemon unexpected types. Following them, we have Prism Star Pokemon. These are an interesting case as there are both Prism Star Pokemon and Prism Star Stadiums. I believe making this the only variant that applies to Pokemon cards and non-Pokemon cards. Interestingly, when a Prism card would be sent to the graveyard, it is banished instead, like a terrible self-attacking dimension shifter. Ancient Trait Pokemon. This is also a weird one, as ancient traits aren't individually unique exactly, and instead, a Pokemon can have one from a list of ancient traits. Those ancient traits being Alpha Recovery, Alpha Growth, Omega Barrage, Omega Barrier, Delta Plus, Delta Evolution, Delta Wild, Theta Stop, Theta Double, and Theta Max. We come to the final entry from the TCG, Terra Pokemon. Not called TX or Gamma or anything like that, they're just Terras, or terrestrialized Pokemon. They enjoy taking no damage while on the bench, and similar to Delta Pokemon, feature different typings than their typical counterparts. Now let's take a look at the spin-offs and side games. I thought it would be really fun to start off this section with toy Pokemon. Not the ones that you buy in a supermarket. Taking a look at Pokemon Rumble, you get to see the interesting cross between what Pokemon and Pixar would be like, with these sentient toy Pokemon. They need to be wound up in order to function and do anything. Toy Pokemon, despite coming in the typical Pokemon form, also can be found in shiny toy Pokemon and rusted toy Pokemon. Oh, what's that? What's a rusted toy Pokemon? Well, that's a toy Pokemon that's been abandoned and in disrepair for so long that it's rusted to the point that it can hardly move. Let's take a look at Colosseum and XD with Shadow Pokemon. Making a Shadow Pokemon is sort of like giving a Pokemon a reversible lobotomy that takes away basically all of their emotions and turns them into a
uncaring killing machine.
These Pokemon even get treated to their own Dragon Ball Xenoverse villainous forms. The exact process of how to make a Shadow Pokemon is never fully elaborated on or disclosed. However, there are a few ways to purify one of these Pokemon. Spending time with it, training with it, giving it a deep tissue massage, taking it to an onion fairy. All these things work. Now you think we might be done with Shadow Pokemon after Colosseum and XD. But let's talk about Pokemon Go Shadow Pokemon. These Shadow Pokemon have a visible aura, unlike the ones from Colosseum and XD, and this sort of distinction is what makes me put them in two separate places. On top of that, Shadow Pokemon in Pokemon Go get a Shadow bonus to their stats, and have the move Frustration. Empowered with darkness similar to their XD counterparts, these can also be purified as well. They get turned into Purified Pokemon. A Pokemon can be purified by shoving candy and stardust down its throat. And similar to the overworld brilliant Pokemon from Sword and Shield, they get a sparkly appearance and boosted stats. On top of that, they also cost less resources to do things like evolve. Also in Pokemon Go, we have Lucky Pokemon. This one's an odd one because it doesn't occur upon catching the Pokemon, it occurs upon trading the Pokemon with somebody else. Lucky Pokemon receive a boost to their stats, as well as a lowered requirement for powering up. They too also get a cool glowy aura. Nearing the end, we have Illumina Pokemon. This, or something similar, needs to return to the series. I love glowing Pokemon. They're adorable. I love it. Introduced in the new Pokemon Snap. Please, we need more. Let's talk about Poxels. While you might confuse them with the toy Pokemon from earlier in the series, these are actual, fully sentient, organic, alive Pokemon that are like Minecraft cubes. And the only reason behind this is because of the island they live on. Somehow living on this island turns organic creatures into blocks, and I don't understand how. And last but not least, all the Magikarp. All of them. There's a lot. Animes and movie now. First up with the movies and anime, let's go for the Valencian Pokemon. The Pokemon native to Valencia Island are interesting as they all display unique markings and coloration as opposed to any other species living anywhere else. Different from both the shiny or regional looks of some of these Pokemon, it is seemingly unexplained why. However, similar to shiny Pokemon, everything past this visual distinction is identical. Clone Pokemon. A result of our Mewtwo trying to get back at humanity and other Pokemon, he cloned a bunch of the ones we know and love, and for some reason a bunch of them got tribal tattoos. Pinkan Island Pokemon. Every Pokemon that lives on this island is neon pink. It's said this is a result of them feeding on the berries of the island, so theoretically you could make any Pokemon pink by force feeding them these berries long enough? I think Pokemon should let us do this. Pokemopolis. Pokeopolis? It's kind of like Pokemon Atlantis. This ancient civilization is now currently nothing but ruins and a handful of cursed items. These cursed items contain actual ancient Pokemon within them, probably the Pokemon, not just the spirit. Each of the Pokemon that had been sealed away in these cursed items have a unique size, visual appearance, and personality. And honestly, I would love to see something like this return in a future game. Next, let's tackle Bond Pokemon. So, the Bond phenomenon / Bond transformations have been only really barely touched on in Pokemon. The primary example we have is Ash and Ash Greninja. However, it's kind of talked about and implied that this used to be seen with more Pokemon and trainers. As a result, I think it'd be really, really cool to see more versions of these Bond phenomenon with more Pokemon. Maybe that's how we get more evolutions. Although I'd like to point out that this taped up big water shuriken wielding version of Greninja is for some reason completely excluded in modern Pokemon. Despite the ability Battle Bond still being there, and you can bring in Greninja, he can't transform. It's just gone. It's no longer functional. Why? Okay, let's go over some one-off / uniques that I just wanted to mention. Shadow Lugia, Crystal Onyx, Shadow Mewtwo, Metagarudon, Thuffizer, Black Fog, and Black Tyranitar. All of these I talked previously about plenty in this video. Red Genesect. This is an odd one because some people may argue this is just a shiny Genesect, but I think there are a lot further implications. If Team Plasma's Project G is anything to go by, then Red Genesect is meant to serve as a leader or an alpha to other Genesect. Not only does it serve as sort of an alpha or a leader in these roles, but it's also given a very unique distinction, where it's not called shiny, it's specifically called red Genesect, across multiple different types of Pokemon media. It's also described as being swifter and stronger than a regular Genesect, so there's obviously something more to it than just being a shiny. As a result, I think it gets its spot mentioned here. Primal Dialga. This is different from the Primal Reversions because calling this Primal Dialga is kind of a misnomer, as this Dialga has a lot less to do with any sort of primal connection. Instead, it's just a Dialga that's been overwhelmed and consumed by the powers it holds over time. Honestly, something more like distorted or time corrupted would work a lot better as a name for this version of Palkia than Primal. Eternal Flower Floette. Now, this companion of AZ from X and Y, that was a lot of letters, he committed a crime against nature in order to bring it back to life. Afterwards, it got really upset and left him alone. But this Floette sports a unique coloration, a unique flower, and a unique move, never seen before or since, and also has not actually appeared in any playable capacity in the games. That's great. I want to mention Eternamax here as well, where Eternamax is essentially Eternatus's exclusive version of Dynamax/Gigantamaxing. However, it goes above and beyond. Eternamax is a complete overhaul. It turns into an incomprehensibly large being spiraling off into the distance, and has the most insanely large stat pool we've ever seen in Pokemon. Oh god, we're almost to the end. Finally. Let's look at the manga and look at the Pokemon fusions, both human and non-human. On multiple occasions, there are references to things like Pokemon fusion or explicit Pokemon fusion, like the case with Black and White. The Pokemon featured in the Rebirth manga have the capability to fuse with humans, boosting the human's attributes, kinda just becoming battle armor for the person to wear. And similar to Mega Evolutions, you require a Pokemon-specific Burst Heart in order to activate these forms. Spiky-eared Pichu. Some people may say that this shouldn't be counted here, but he's adorable, I love him, and why can't I have him in the recent games? Golden Pseudo-Wudo. Spray paint your Pokemon. The Starmobiles/theoretical branched evolutions of Revavroom. Now, Revavroom is an interesting case because it seems to be the most explicit example of humans modifying a Pokemon to their own will. As you see, Revarooms literally just get put in as essentially the engines of a larger vehicle. And this can be taken as one of two ways. Either this is essentially an evolution for the Pokemon, in which case, okay, cool. Or they just strapped a Pokemon into a vehicle as the engine and force it to be a sentient car for the rest of its life. Pokestar Studio Monsters. These ones are an interesting glimpse because it's a theoretical look into what people in the Pokemon universe would find fictional or hard to believe. I really wish they were usable Pokemon, but they're not. And honestly, at this point in the series, a fair amount of their designs would work as actual usable Pokemon. Here's a list of a couple of the enemies that appear that I just think are funny though. A transporter, a tall mommy to step on you, literally an entire space fleet, a robot, and a gate. And I mean, they even predicted Iron Thorns way before Scarlet and Violet. Last on our list, the Eevee. This amazing little creature. I love them so much. They are an Eevee with the ability to evolve and unevolve completely at will. It just has complete and utter control of its unstable genetics. Wow, that took way longer than it should have. Who knew that they had decided to make so many variants, transformations, and different takes on Pokemon throughout the years? And especially, how many of them in the card game are just the exact same thing with a slightly different name? It's extremely frustrating. I just think that the Pokemon franchise is missing out on going back and capitalizing on the potential of some of these past mechanics. I mean, imagine how cool it would be to get a new Pokemon game that includes primal reversions for a whole new cast of Mons. And for the ones that don't get primal forms, maybe they all get ancient traits. Maybe you have this form-changing Eevee and you're sent into a safari-like zone full of Delta Pokemon, having to use your Eevee's ability to adapt its type to challenge all these Pokemon with unexpected types that you've never seen on them before. So much potential for so many interesting games and spin-offs. Please, Pokemon Company, do not waste this potential. Anyways, that's pretty much all forms and variants of Pokemon across all kinds of media. I probably forgot a couple, but it's a pretty comprehensive list. Like, subscribe, leave a comment if I got anything wrong. See you next time.